it's really great to be in Cape Town where there's a bit of water and summer has finally arrived. It wasn't here 2 weeks ago. But also really to be talking on this topic, which is, as Linda Gale has said, I think something that's very close to my heart. I'm not under the age of 25. In fact, I've probably spent 2 decades working in this area. But I think it's really topical that we discuss it now, both because of where we are in the region, but also because of the time that we're in HIV and the really sort of the real opportunities in HIV prevention. My job was really to say, what do we know? And so what I want to reflect on is why we need to include adolescents in HIV trials. And when I talk about adolescents, I'm talking about that population that's under the age of under the age of 18 and above the age of 12. That's sort of defined in terms of the kind of licensure requirements, but also youth who sometimes contribute to some of these populations. But also share a little bit with you about what the current status of adolescent trials is, what the barriers to inclusion of adolescents in trials, and what we can do to ensure their inclusion. This was a fairly broad scope, so one of the things I do want to flag up is that when it comes to talking about some of the things that can be done, you can look forward to Lee Fairley's presentation. She's going to talk a lot more about the kind of trial design issues and the specific suggestions for sort of managing some of the logistical challenges. So really to kind of put it in context, about 3/4 of new HIV infections occur in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this graph really shows the countries where the HIV prevalence in young women is above 1%. And these are countries where probably prevalence is equivalent to incidence and show kind of very high burdens of infection in our region. What's also important is that we've seen a growing number of young people living with HIV but unfortunately not experiencing the benefits of expanded access to antiretroviral therapy. And there are about 55,000 deaths due to HIV in the last year, and AIDS is the leading cause of mortality amongst young people in Africa. So these are 2 reasons really why we should be paying attention to including young people in trials. They are the ones that are experiencing the burden of disease. The second reason that we really need to pay attention to this issue here and now is because of the youth bulge in Sub-Saharan Africa. And many of you may have heard about this, but the idea is that in Sub-Saharan Africa, this is one of the regions where population growth will expand, unlike other regions, and the largest demographic subgroup will be under the age of 25. And importantly for HIV, within the next 10 or so years, the youth population will have doubled to the size that it was at the start of the HIV epidemic. So in terms of susceptibles that need access to prevention, this has increased the challenge for us working in the field. And so when we think about the absolute increase in the number of susceptibles within the population in our region, we really need to invest in an expanded range of prevention options that will be required to control the epidemic. And that means investing in trials to develop these new technologies, be they for treatment as prevention or primary prevention. And this graph really just tries to sort of articulate kind of how behind we are in terms of achieving our Prevention 2020 targets and our goal of sort of fast-tracking the end to HIV. The model shows kind of basically what would have happened if we assume no population growth between 2010 and 2017 in the region. And if there'd been no population growth, it would be just under maybe 1/3 of a million new HIV infections in the region without the HIV, rather the youth bulge. So really just showing that population expansion alone is kind of increasing demands on services, and those are services that are already constrained. And so we really need to escalate our efforts to respond to HIV. And I think the other issue that Linda Gale touched on, but that is an important lesson for us, is that if we don't think about including adolescents and young people in trials now or at the development of new products, we run the risk of having them left behind. And the experience of HPV vaccine introduction is salutary. vaccines were originally licensed in 1981. It took another 10 years to get a licensure for minors. And, kind of in our part of the world, hepatitis B vaccination is part of the EPI, the infant vaccination program. But you can see that sort of over that period, it's taken an enormous amount of time to sort of achieve reductions in hepatitis B incidence, signaling the importance, really, if you want to achieve impacts on infections, you really need to kind of make sure that your licensure package includes data on those populations that are going to be using these products. So why is it then, if this is so important, that we haven't really included adolescent and youth in trials? And what are some of the issues about why it's important to include this particular population and not just children in general? And I'm sure many of you in the room appreciate that adolescence is really a period of enormous transition from childhood through to adulthood. And it's associated with a number of hormonal changes that are signaled by puberty that initiate changes both in brain development as well as physical development. And with those changes in cognitive and physical development and pubertal maturation, we see associated with that kind of social changes. So transitions from school out of the home to jobs or further education, increasing seeking of partnerships, and kind of eventually sort of establishing oneself in marriage or other relationships and going on into adulthood. So this is a very complex period, and sort of even within adolescence, there are sort of early, middle, and late adolescence. But importantly, for our perspective, there are changes that can either be sort of as a result of the biological changes, or there can also be behavioral changes. And these biological changes can affect responses to drugs or vaccines. For example, during puberty, there is enormous change in the body composition, change in fat distribution, which can influence response to particular drugs. Age-related changes can also change how drugs are metabolized, and age-related differences really lead to differences in vaccine responses. And a couple of practical examples are with HPV vaccines, we give them to younger children because we see higher immune responses than in older adolescents. Certainly when it comes to topical products like microbicides, we've seen very different results based on the product that's involved, with some products showing greater efficacy in younger age groups and some showing worse efficacy. And it's probably a combination of the biology, but also the behavior. So behavioral changes also obviously affect responses to drugs or vaccines. So how you take your pills, whether you take your pills, how you behave as a result of thinking you're protected or not, and a range of other behaviors, just whether it's possible to kind of participate in monitoring and other clinic activities, your choice of partners, means that the kind of experiences that adolescents have when using HIV prevention products may be sufficiently different from adults that we can't simply extrapolate from adults. And what we need is to understand both the biology and the behavior in the context of these products in order to make sure that we are able to kind of provide products that are safe and effective for young people. So what are the risks of excluding adolescents from trials? Well, Linda Gale talked about the biggest one, which is that up until very recently, most products were licensed for adults, and then we saw a lot of off-label use in young people, children through to adolescents. And that off-label prescribing can often mean that, in fact, people are getting the wrong dose, and that wrong dose could be associated either with toxicity or with subtherapeutic effects, in which case it doesn't work for them at all. It could be the wrong formulation, so pills might not be ideal for all populations, may lead to people crushing their pills, that may change the bioavailability, and so again, people might not be getting the right dose. It can, in cases, result in accidental poisoning if information about adverse events is not available and not included in package inserts, and parents or even young adolescents are unaware of some of the issues associated with over or underdosing. And what is a particular concern for adolescents as well is that we might want to understand how these products work in the context of background substance use, but also what happens if people use these products to overdose. And I think we've had very practical experience in the PrEP studies of young people overdosing on Truvada because of suicidal ideation. So these are important questions that are particular to this population, and the consequences of not doing this work are severe for this population as well. So what is the current status of adolescent trials? And I want to really touch on sort of the general idea and then kind of a couple of specific examples. So in reviewing the literature, I just was struck by this point because it's so obvious, but in fact, it's really been kind of an issue for young people, which is that everyone deserves medicines that meet their needs. All medicines need to be given at the correct dose with an acceptable risk-benefit profile. Medicine should be of good pharmaceutical quality and legally enforceable quality assurance of all aspects of their development and use. But in fact, this has not been done for young people and children until very recently. And so in about 2007, the US and the European regulatory authorities, because of these concerns about off-label use of products for adolescents and children, and because really of the slow pace at which products were being licensed for use in children, they both independently set up requirements that actually sort of prompt product developers to pay far more attention to their pediatric development plans. So within the FDA, there are two pieces of legislation, one of which in fact incentivizes manufacturers to make sure that they have pediatric development plans as part of their product development process and guarantees them sort of exclusive marketing within 6 months of licensure. But then there are also a number of prerequisites which are linked to the timing of when you move from phase 2 to phase 3 trials, which require that there should be plans put in place that articulate how adolescents or children will fit into the licensure package and be part of the product development pathway, and what additional data requirements might be needed. So these can be reviewed by the regulatory authorities, and they can be assured that when they receive the full data package, they will be able to license for an over 18-year age group, but may be able to request additional data, which could then assist with licensing for a younger age group. So this has been a really important advance. But despite that, I think we're still lagging behind. So this is a paper that was published in the Journal of Adolescent Health a couple of years ago. And it was a review that was done essentially of 2 clinical trials registries, where they searched for trials that were essentially involving HIV prevention products. And they looked at the inclusion of minors. And they found a total of 111 unique studies, but only 10 of those studies included minors. And what they found, in fact, was that young people are underrepresented in the early phase studies, but overrepresented in the treatment trials. And kind of the point to kind of take away from this is that we don't want to include young people in the development of prevention products, but yet we understand the importance of providing access to treatment for them. And so kind of really we need to switch our priorities into kind of preventing these infections and not responding just when it comes to access to treatment. So why are we in this situation where product developers, a range of stakeholders, perhaps have not really advocated for the inclusion of adolescents in these trials? And why is it that only 9% of these trials have really targeted adolescents? There are a number of barriers, and there are a couple of very useful reviews that articulate this as a series of ecological model where there are individual level barriers and then kind of outward rings of barriers. And what I want to try and do is just cover them and then illustrate a couple of examples. So one of the fundamental things that we talked about early on was this, that adolescence is a period of development, and associated with that, therefore, is variable levels of cognitive maturity. And one of the key questions is, are adolescents cognitively able to consent? And what additional materials and support might they need if they're going to consent to participate in trials? Some of the other concerns are really related around the stigma associated with disclosure of sexual activity. If I participate in this trial which enrolls sexually active people, what does it say about me and my sexual behavior, or vice versa if I don't enroll? And also kind of for LGBTQ populations, does it amount to disclosing their sexual orientation, perhaps at a time where they're not ready to kind of have public disclosure of their orientation? And this is particularly important for this age group because, as we know, peer acceptance and the views of peers are incredibly important during adolescence as young people transition from the home into building relationships with people outside of the family. And as a result of these issues, there is the potential and the concern that we may be exposing young people, because of their developing cognitive abilities, contrast against the potential for stigma and harm, a greater risk of harm in this population compared to an adult population. And a consequence of this might be, even if we put a number of regulations in place, that young people themselves will restrict whether or not they present to these studies because of their interpretation of what our biases might be, and their interpretation of our views around what our prejudices might be. So families are also a barrier, and in fact there's a lot in the literature about the role that parents play. A unique feature of adolescence under the age of 18 is that most regulatory or rather jurisdictions suggest that parents provide consent and under 18s provide assent for participation in research. And there are a number of practical and logistical barriers. Parents or guardians may simply not be available, so they may be involved, but they're busy working, and that's a particular issue in our region. We have to balance the requirements for parental consent against the need really to protect the privacy of adolescents who may be engaging in sexual activity and may not wish to disclose this to their parents. There are also barriers where parents may not understand the research. They may have concerns about harm or stigma and want to protect their child. Every person who's a parent knows that desire to protect your child. And so they may not understand the risk-benefit ratio. They may not be like investigators who are able to sort of quantify these risks. But also the types of consent forms we produce mean that we have to list every risk and kind of turn kind of what might not be common risks. We still have to list them and can create very intimidating documents for people to read and sign off on. And the other thing that's emerged, particularly in our area, is that often this may cause uncomfortable conversations in families because the parents then have to disclose their status to the child. And I think that things are changing, and certainly kind of I've seen this be a challenge, but I've also seen a benefit because many women living with HIV have encouraged their daughters to join PrEP trials because they don't want them to become infected with HIV. But these are some of the potential family barriers. There are also community barriers, and one of the big ones that's listed is really the kind of universal mistrust of research. In many communities where these power differentials are very high, there is a mistrust of what researchers are doing, who is paying them, what the benefits are that they get out of this, and this is often something that we need to address. And in South Africa, this has been a particular issue for us, and the news headline really sort of highlights this kind of underlying view that in some ways investigators might be exploiting young girls in order to kind of carry out HIV trials. Reimbursement can cause problems in communities because young women can become independent of their partners with this money, and that may cause challenges and may cause kind of negative reactions from some people in the community. For some communities where there is not direct benefit to participants initially, they may not see the benefit of participation. And then communities also have concerns about whether or not the kind of investments in HIV prevention actually are therefore condoning or promoting precocious sexual activity, and their view that in some ways it gives young people license to go out and have sex. Now, we know this is not the case and there's not evidence to support that, but that is a view that's widely held and one that we need to address. And then part of communities are really the laws that govern our behavior. And so ethico-legal frameworks are very much, there are universal norms, but also there are very kind of context-specific. And so kind of there are a variety of approaches to the age of consent in different countries in the region. In the case of adolescents, there are also requirements for mandatory reporting of abuse or harms to young people. And sometimes these laws are inconsistent and contradictory. If we take the case of South Africa, you can consent to a number of medical procedures sort of from the age of 12. You're able to consent to sex at the age of 16, but you can only consent to research at the age of 18. And this is often very difficult to navigate. And I just want to share with you a kind of practical example that we had, not in HIV, but learning from HPV vaccination, which has been sort of given up as an example potentially for HIV, where when we conducted some research with young people, we had to go through approvals from the Department of Education, approvals from the school, approvals from the parents, and we also got adolescent consent. So we had sort of 4 levels of approval just to conduct this research. And when we actually went through the consent process, forms were often not returned or poorly completed. This wasn't even investigational product work, but it was clear that there were lower literacy levels with caregivers that kind of needed to be addressed. And the issue of absent caregivers was very prominent, with some young people not really having anyone who could sign a form for them. And it was very hard to follow up on some of these issues with these young people. But it's interesting because it did teach us a lot about kind of people's views and communities about what the role of parents is with respect to young people in terms of consent. And while the immunization framework is slightly different, I think it is illustrative that, parents on the one hand feel very strongly that they have a duty of care to their children, even if they're adolescents and kind of emerging into adulthood, and that, kind of they should be signing consent on behalf of minors. And for some younger adolescents, they really wanted their parents to be involved. They said things like, I don't know all about my health. I need my parents to be involved. But for many of us who work in clinical trials, often these requirements are a barrier. And what we want to promote is empowerment of young people and autonomy of young people in terms of their decisions. And it's important that communities are sensitive to this, and they are able to kind of understand situations where it's important to support young people and to protect their privacy. But it's also kind of important for us to know that decision-making about participation in some of these activities is often not just at the level of individual, and often involves kind of multiple viewpoints. And it's important that we recognize that when we do stakeholder engagement. And these quotes just really illustrate, I think, those 2 perspectives, and this idea from young people as well, which is that they don't necessarily always want to be independent and autonomous. Sometimes it's important to be able to consult with trusted adults. So another thing I wanted to flag up, just because some of you in the room are investigators, is really that we are barriers. And I can admit this myself because there are tensions within the HIV prevention field. On the one hand, we have this huge imperative to deliver trials that will produce a result and lead to licensure, sort of within kind of realistic programmatic timeframes. And we know that the trial requirements, like the visit schedules and the kind of frequency of coming back and forth and the volumes that are going to be required and the adherence requirements, are not going to be as well implemented by adolescents. And if we want to achieve our goals of kind of getting to licensure, there is a tendency to want to stay away from these more challenging populations. I think there are a number of biases about what adolescents can achieve achieve, and this has emerged particularly in the reporting of some results of HIV prevention trials, like the VOICE trial, where, kind of young women particularly were blamed for not using the product. And subsequently, kind of issues have emerged about, kind of the importance of understanding end user preferences, understanding the integration of these methods into young people's lives. But we do have biases, and we need to be aware of those. And we need to recognize that not all trial sites are going to be accommodating for young people. Kind of not all of them have designed to be youth-friendly clinics, although I'm proud to say I do work at one. And often there aren't materials that are accessible to young people that perhaps kind of can support their requirements for greater time to be spent around the consent process or explaining kind of complicated procedures or scientific concepts that we take for granted. So what can be done? And really, I just want to highlight three things. I think the first thing is it's incredibly important that we as a body articulate the justification for why we need to include young people in trials. Trials in adolescents are required. I hope I've convinced you of that. But they are also feasible and acceptable. And there's a growing body of literature from the microbicide field, from the vaccine field, and from open-label studies of PrEP, which demonstrate that it's feasible and acceptable to enroll these populations into trials that often their risk profiles are higher than older adolescents, and yet they have the same or fewer adverse events and are able to comprehend the undertakings associated with the trial. But also, adolescents will actually adhere to schedules. And this is data from the ATN 113, which was part of the package that went for licensure of Truvada. And while pill taking is challenging, it's probably not that different from many other adult populations. So it's important as well that we kind of recalibrate people's views about what adolescents can actually achieve under the right circumstances and support. The second thing that we have to do is really recognize that this is a collaborative effort and requires the building of partnerships. This means early engagement with ethics and regulatory groups to understand the data that they might require or the issues that they need help with managing. We should also recognize that youth need to be the center of these discussions, and that youth and youth cabs can be incredibly valuable in guiding around the design of trial sites, the design of materials, the design of processes, and anticipating issues that older people may not necessarily kind of factor in to these trial designs. Another important group that we've learned from the oral PrEP studies are important to engage are parents. And this is because young people do talk to their parents, and they do often have discussions with their parents, and often their parents are less informed than them. And it's unfair of us to put the onus of explanation about HIV prevention on young people, but really to recognize that parents are partners, we need to engage with them, and they will have an important role to play in this process. And obviously, kind of the broader community and addressing some of the earlier concerns I flagged and building off that. And kind of I put this article, which Linda Gale in fact authored, which goes through a very nice framework for how you can begin to think through the issues associated with benchmarks for improving kind of the review of trials in adolescents. And it addresses kind of the important considerations of articulating the social value, the scientific validity, the fair selection of participants, and so forth. And so I'd recommend that you have a look at that. And the other important recommendation that's come out of the literature, particularly in our context, is that if people are concerned about social harms, that we actually collect the data on social harms. Because if we collect that data, we can actually show that it's a concern or not, as the case might be, but really kind of generating evidence around social harms would be another important piece that will respond to some of the concerns of these stakeholders. And so in the last few minutes, I really want to talk then about trial designs and set the scene, I hope, for Lee. And the first recommendation, which really came from a collaborative group that's supported by Impact, the Impact Network, but also WHO, is really sort of 3 points about trial designs. The first is to think about what data are required. And that might be sort of data around sort of incidence and prevalence of disease in that population and any data on feasibility studies. but it also is specific to that product and that indication, and sort of what is the role of the drug in terms of the age, the setting, and where it's going to be placed in the prevention or treatment portfolio. And then adopt an exercise to understand what data can be extrapolated from adults, but what is child or adolescent specific. For example, if disease progression is similar, if the response to treatment is similar, and if the exposure response is similar, then kind of it's fair to extrapolate data. And then perhaps all that's required are acceptability studies. And so the suggestion is to use this extrapolation algorithm, which the FDA has introduced, to really understand how to identify what data actually needs to be collected from adolescents and what can be extrapolated from adults. The second approach is really to use efficient trial designs and to consider innovative options. And one of the sort of fields that's been really useful, particularly in licensure of products for adolescents and children, has been the role of bridging studies and PK/PD modeling studies, which have helped us then to understand if the PK/PD can be translated to younger populations. Can that assist us with licensing these products? But also there are ideas about dose de-escalation, so starting with older age groups and moving down as you increase the body of safety data. Another option is to consider including adolescents as a population once a kind of large trial has accumulated sufficient endpoints or population, and so adding them in toward the end of a trial when you have enough safety data to kind of encourage you to move forward into younger age groups. But these are some of the options that are potentially available to explore within trial designs. And the third idea is really to start these trials as early as possible, so not to wait till the end of the phase 3 trial to then begin a pediatric indication, but to start the planning as early as possible. And where, kind of I think the field is moving is really to kind of thinking about what data can even be gained from animal studies in juvenile animals that might be informative to the performance of these products in younger age groups. And certainly those animal models do exist. But then based on safety profiles, looking at including younger age groups in as early phase 1-2 studies, as well as kind of these inclusion of adolescents in later phase studies. So I think that we're getting better, and the Truvada experience is one experience. It's not ideal, but it shows what can be done when people are thinking about the adolescent indication. The FDA approved Truvada in 2012. A number of studies were implemented, ATN 110 and ATN 113 in the US, and the Plus Pill study here in South Africa, which collected additional safety data and PK data in adolescents as young as 15 up to 19. And this information was presented to the FDA, and as a result of that, the FDA licensed Truvada for a population at risk for HIV infection that weighed at least 35 kilos. So in fact, was silent to some extent on age and focused just on weight. This was important data that meant that Truvada is now accessible to, has an indication, a licensed indication, and we're not going to be using it off-label when we prescribe PrEP to young people. What we hope is that future trials, like trials of long-acting injectables, are actually going to do parallel processes so that the license package that lands on the FDA desk or the SAPRA desk includes data on adolescents. And so there are ongoing conversations at the moment about what these regulatory authorities want exactly and how we can then provide that to them. So just to summarize, the inclusion of adolescents in HIV trials is essential if we want to understand safety, efficacy, and use of these products in these populations. The progress of inclusion of adolescents in these trials has been slow to date. And we need to recognize that adolescents have specific needs that need to be addressed when designing trials. But many of these barriers can be overcome and have actually been overcome. And, there's growing evidence to show that we can successfully enroll adolescents in trials. And there are many lessons to be learned from these early studies, as well as the now open label PrEP studies. And critical to all of this process is really kind of collaboration and stakeholder involvement right at the get-go. So thanks very much.
Thanks.